What's up guys, and welcome to another comparison video. This is one that's been on my mind for some time. We are going to compare the NC3 generation Mazda Miata against the ND2 generation. We are currently in Danny's 2013 NC3. It's a base trim with a 5-speed manual transmission instead of a 6-speed. It's got the updated 2-liter engine that revs a bit higher for the NC3 facelift. This makes 167 horsepower stock with 140 pound-feet of torque. It should weigh somewhere in the 2,400 pound range, considering this is the lightest model with a soft top, 5-speed transmission, very few creature comforts, very Spartan interior. And the owner Danny has done a few mods to it to improve the overall handling and performance envelope. He has an AEM intake with a tune. He estimates this might be pushing out closer to 180 horsepower at the crank. He's also got the Sakebomb Öhlins DFV suspension with an RX-8 front sway bar. And we're on some tire rack aftermarket wheels. I actually didn't know tire rack made essentially TE37 knockoffs, but these are a 17x9, and he's running a 245 section width Hankook RS4 all around. So we'll be comparing this car, which should be attainable for under $20,000 in the current market. Compare that to the ND2 generation. The one we're about to drive is a 2019, which is the first model year for the ND2 with the higher revving engine. And you're looking at roughly a $10,000 price difference, all else equal. Is it worth it? Is it worth the extra money? If you want that purity of a Miata, the lightweight, the short wheelbase, the fun to drive characteristic with light steering and a slick manual transmission, and the tossability that these cars have been known for well over 3 decades, which car should you spend your money on? That's what we're gonna find out. Again, very low cost interior here. Even the steering wheel doesn't feel like anything special. Thin rim, 3-spoke, but the materials, kind of that shiny hard plastic. The dash covered in cheap plastic. It's what you'd expect. It's a Miata. It's a bare bones, back to basics sports car. This one has 73,000 miles on the odometer. It looks to be in pretty good shape. Not perfect by any means, but hey, it's a Miata. You're meant to drive it every single day. Manual handbrake, hydraulic steering, which is great. This is the last generation Miata to have that. Forgot to mention, Danny also added a Torsen rear limited slip differential, as this one did not come with that. It had an open diff from the factory. Very revvy little engine, this 2-liter. Revs out to 7,500 RPM and makes peak power at 7,000. Those numbers basically match, at least the RPM. The peak power comes in at the same RPM as the ND2 engine. Very light steering, and actually it doesn't load up a whole lot in the corners. Something I've noticed actually with every generation of Miata. I did a NA versus NB versus NC versus ND comparison quite a while ago, and that was one thing they all have in common: very light front end. Of course, if you actually look at this car from the side with the hood popped, the engine sits mostly behind the front axle, so this is probably considered a front midship design, which means the car loves to rotate. Very little weight over that front axle. And because of the relatively long hood proportional to the rest of the body, the driver sits fairly far back. So the weight distribution is really quite good. Good throttle response, naturally aspirated engine. Feel underpowered for a Miata. It feels so much quicker than any NA or NB that I've driven with natural aspiration. The manual transmission is good. It's typical Mazda. Sometimes can feel a little bit vague when shifting, especially going from second to third, but overall it's positive. Very light and easy to use. The throws are relatively short. It matches the character of the car. such an easy car to drive. It moves around a little bit under braking with that short wheelbase. It's a very, well, it's a car that feels like it wants to rotate at all times. Very sensitive to inputs, steering ratio, not overly quick, it's just right. I just wish it loaded up more. It doesn't have enough power, especially mid-range torque, to really get the rear to step out all that easily. And the 5-speed is a little bit longer in terms of the gearing. And so most of this road you can actually do in second gear. The 6-speed does have closer ratios. Really want to keep this engine at 5,000 plus RPM. Heel toe is a cinch. Stock brakes feel totally adequate for a car that weighs around 2,400 pounds. That's the beauty of a Miata. Whichever generation you get, it's easy on consumables. Parts are cheap, maintenance is affordable. You can just drive the crap out of these cars without breaking the bank. That's the beauty of the Miata. Really digging this little engine. Loves to rev. Oh yes. Plenty of grip here too. Hankook RS4 tires. Great balance for aggressive canyon driving. The suspension feels good, but there is a little bit of bounce at that rear end. Might need to dial in the damping settings a bit. One last straight line pull. I am pleasantly surprised by the acceleration of this NC3. I think if you're going to go the NC generation, make sure you get the 167 horsepower version, because this engine has more power than you might expect for a Miata. If you're used to an NA or NB, even with the 1.8, this is a whole step above that in terms of power. And there's actually reasonably good mid-range torque as well. Overall, a super fun car to drive. Love the balance. The handling is so good with the double wishbone front suspension, multi-link rear, same as the ND2. But it's just such a fun little car to toss around. Now it's time to see if that ND2 is really worth the extra money. All right, ND2 Miata. I've driven so many of these over the years, and it's always been one of my favorite sub $35,000 brand new sports cars. This one is a 2019 model year, and the owner Jordan has done quite a few choice mods to it. This one also has Öhlins from Sakebomb. We're on the long stroke rear dampers, so this should feel a little bit more composed and compliant over the bumps. We have a Wilwood big brake kit up front, 17 by 9 inch Titan 7 wheels with Dunlop Direzza ZIII tires, another 200 treadwear compound. It should be pretty comparable to the RS4s on Danny's car. This has an OEM rear limited slip differential. And given that it is the RF hardtop model, this car should weigh just over 2,300 pounds. So the weight difference between these two cars should be, in theory, less than 100 pounds. So we're powered by a 2-liter inline 4-cylinder engine. When it was stock, it made 181 horsepower. But this car has one very special trick up its sleeve, and that is an Edelbrock supercharger. And at 5 psi of boost, this is estimated to be making around 220 wheel horsepower and approximately 180 pound-feet of torque. That puts it on par with something like an AP2 S2000. It still has a very linear power curve, so I'm going to focus a little bit more on how this car dynamically feels in terms of the handling as compared with the NC3. Interior is much nicer than the NC3. It feels so much more modern. The materials are of a much higher grade. We actually have leather across the dash here with very nice stitching, some nice metallic bits around the AC vents and the HVAC controls here. Much nicer steering wheel as well. Doors, you know, there's still quite a bit of plastic, but the overall look and feel is far superior to that of the base NC3. Stock redline was 7,500 RPM, but with the supercharger, the redline has been lowered to around 68 to 6,900. We also have front double wishbone suspension, multi-link rear, just like the NC3, but crucially, we have electric power steering. Let's see if this feels a lot more numb compared to that hydraulic rack in the NC3. Oh, we also have a Goodwin catback exhaust. I'll put the full list of mods for both cars in the video description. 220 wheel horsepower in a 2,300 pound car. Oh yeah, that's much quicker than a stock ND2 and much, much quicker than that NC3. Nice tone from this Goodwin exhaust. Ooh. Oh yeah, that is a great power level for the ND2 chassis. Throttle response is still good, but it seems not as sensitive as I would like. It requires a heavy blip of the throttle to get it rev matched properly. Not sure if that's because of the supercharger or even the stock ND2 tuning is like this. Nice brake feel from the Wilwood big brake kit. Oh yeah, this is phenomenal. The steering being an EPS rack, honestly, I'm having a hard time differentiating whether this has actually less steering feel than the NC3's hydraulic rack. This still feels really good. Still not top-notch steering feel. Doesn't load up as much in the corners as I would like, and there's not a whole lot of information about the road surface coming through the wheel, but it's definitely good. It is good steering, especially relative to modern cars. Really good mid-range torque. The supercharger keeps the power band very, very flat. Drivability is excellent. Oh, that's fifth gear. The shifter is definitely an improvement over the NC3. It's a little bit slicker, a little bit more mechanical, perhaps. But you still can miss-shift, as I just demonstrated. The throws are so short and closely spaced together. This suspension is definitely better than the Öhlins on the NC3. I have a feeling it's because these have the long stroke rear dampers from Sakebomb. Danny doesn't have them on his car, and you can definitely feel the difference. Oh, just so lightweight and nimble. Myself hitting the rev limiter, 6,800 RPM rev limiter. It just doesn't feel quite right for this car. I'm so used to it having an extra 500 to 600 revs to work with. It feels like the engine wants to keep going. It doesn't feel like it's done. Now, of course, it's probably a safety measure, keeping the revs a little bit lower with the added boost, but I definitely do miss that reviness of the stock ND2 motor, as well as Danny's NC3. Of course, this car is even lighter than the NC3. You can get these at least 200 pounds lighter if you spring for the soft top version, but I don't know if I can really tell a significant weight difference from behind the wheel. Both cars are just so light and tossable. Oh yes. Yep, these long stroke Öhlins definitely doing a really good job on this bumpy road. I can go flat out a lot more. Credit to Sakebomb for developing a proper suspension setup for this platform. But mods aside, how do these two cars feel? They're both so fun to drive. The engine character is actually more similar than not. The handling, I mean, they're both so good. I'm having a hard time choosing between these two. Yes. I do miss the slightly more sensitive throttle response of that NC. Again, I don't know if that's because this ND2 with the supercharger has a duller response. It is drive-by-wire after all, so it's all down to the tuning. But that aside, handling-wise, they're really, really close. Double wishbone front suspension, great brakes on both cars. Even though this one has the Wilwood BBK, I wouldn't say it brakes that much better than Danny's NC3 on stock brakes. These cars are so light, you don't need massive brakes. And that's the beautiful thing about it. Neither of these cars needs a whole lot of work. They're just so cheap to run and to maintain. They're pretty much dead reliable. Just absolutely fantastic platforms for driving pleasure and maybe more importantly, driver training. If you want to practice your driving skill and smoothness, these two cars are perfect tools for that. Now back to the original question, is the ND2 worth the extra roughly $10,000 over the NC3? I would say as a daily driver, if you want the extra creature comforts, you want to feel like you're in something a little bit more modern, or actually a lot more modern, then yeah, maybe that money is worth it. But from a pure driving dynamics standpoint, the NC3, it is the car that doesn't get talked about a whole lot. Exterior look that makes it look actually a lot better in my eyes to the NC1 or NC2. All of those things can be had in a great package that drives, gosh, I would say 90% plus as good as the ND2. If really what you want is that Miata driving experience, but with more performance than an NA or NB, the NC3 might just be the sweet spot, and it might be one of those cars that we look back on in say 5-10 years and think, wow, those were undervalued at the time. $15,000 to say $18,000 for a clean one right now is not a bad time to pick one up. Let me know what you guys think of this comparison. A big shout out to Danny and Jordan for letting me review their Miatas. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.